Well, joining me is Luke de Pulford, Executive Director of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. There was a moment there when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. It was a very brief moment in many ways, but a moment there when it appeared that actually our policy on China was going to get significantly tougher. And yet, Luke, what we've seen China getting ever closer to Putin and Russia, almost to the point where Putin looks like almost a proxy, I think, for China. And we've decided that as the Germans have been to Beijing and the French have been to Beijing, that somehow we have to be part of that club. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's a fair analysis. I'd put it this way. James Cleverly was the Foreign Secretary put in place by Liz Truss. And when that happened, we heard some positive noises from James Cleverly. And now we're getting very different signals from Number 10, particularly from the Prime Minister over China. We hear this very strange phrase, robust pragmatism is how we're supposed to be dealing with China now. I don't know what that means, and it certainly isn't an appropriate strategy for dealing with what is clearly our number one threat, which, by the way, Rishi Sunak even said on the campaign trail.
But he was running then to be leader of the Conservative Party. The tune has changed significantly.
It's changed very significantly indeed. I mean, he promised a number of things. He said he was going to close Confucius Institutes. He said it would change on, quote, day one of his premiership. Did any of that happen? No, it did not. Instead, what we're seeing today is James Cleverly chucking under the bus his Conservative colleagues who've had the bravery to stand up and talk about the Uyghur genocide, who've had the bravery to stand up and talk about the destruction of Hong Kong.
And they, of course, not just the MPs, like Ian Duncan-Smith, for example, and there are others, Bob Seeley, others, not just they that have been sanctioned, but their families, their children that have been sanctioned. Even a story in one of the Sunday newspapers that the daughter of one of those sanctioned MPs didn't get a university place because the university feared Chinese funding might fall.
Yeah, these are not the bad guys. These are not the enemy. The thing which is so distressing about the speech today is that it seems the Foreign Secretary is concentrating as much on attacking them as he is on addressing China. Well, what's all this about? What are we supposed to make of it? I think what it indicates is that our foreign policy seems to be as much about trying to manage difficulties in the Conservative Party as actual foreign policy.
No, well, that's a very strong point. I mean, President Trump, of course, was the one really blowing the trumpet, saying, wake up, everybody, see that China's changed. And indeed, since 2012, since President Xi came in, it has changed significantly. But I tell you what gets me, Luke. I think the public are waking up to this. It's very interesting. Opinion polls on concerns about China, should we buy fewer Chinese goods? And big percentages now agree with that. And yet, what I detect in the House of Commons is that even within the Conservative Party, it's a very small number of MPs who are genuinely concerned about this issue.
This is a really important point, because one of the things that the Foreign Secretary is apparently going to say is that that sort of hardcore of anti-China, noisy people in his own party need to look at the issue more broadly, need to add a bit of nuance. This is a cross-party consensus. If anything, the Labour Party is in a stronger position on China than the Conservative Party.
And where are they then?
Well, you've had the shadow foreign secretary say just in the past few weeks that were they to get into government, they would recognise what is happening against Uyghurs as genocide. That's the same thing Liz Truss said, wasn't able to deliver on it. Well, we're a very long way away from doing that under the current government and the current foreign secretary, very sadly.
The influences are very, very big. You know, you can look at a list of former senior civil servants, big business figures, political figures who've gone on as non-executive directors onto boards. I mentioned Huawei earlier, but we could have talked about other infrastructure companies to do with power, nuclear generation, etc. I mean, isn't the truth that the Chinese lobbying, whether that's on a diplomatic level, bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together in the last few weeks, or whether it's on a personal, financial level, they've been at this for years, and we've only just woken up to it?
I don't think that we have woken up to it. In fact, we're waking up to it so slowly that it almost looks as if we want to be increasingly dependent upon China. The thing which is so remarkable about this is that it's not a secret. This is a clear and explicit strategy on the part of Beijing. Xi Jinping himself said a couple of years ago that they wanted to inculcate dependency of other nations on China, particularly in what he called killer industries, meaning those critical infrastructure areas.
If we put sanctions on China, real sanctions on China, that would hurt us too, though, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would, but you've got to look at this in the round. If Xi Jinping does what he says he's going to do, and if there is some kind of event in Taiwan, be it a blockade or something worse, we will have forced decoupling then. It won't be a choice. It'll be something we have to do. So the question for any government, I think, seeking to prepare for this is to manage the risk. If this thing is coming down the road, what are we doing to prepare for that? Well, I'll tell you what is not the intelligent strategy, is to increase dependency in renewables and so many other areas that we're sleepwalking into. It'll be Ukraine crisis all over again, except 10 times worse.
Yeah, but trouble is, though, with Ukraine, the West has been busily, or most of the West, the Germans have been a bit reluctant, but have been arming Zelensky against the Russians. But if there was a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, we'll all look to America to give us the lead. I suspect we'd do nothing.
Well, I'd put it this way. The Ukraine crisis woke a lot of nations up to the problem of dependency on authoritarian states, but it also woke them up to the issue of standing up to authoritarianism, the inflation crisis and everything that went with it. That's deeply worrying, because this wouldn't be a conflict in Europe. It's thousands of miles away, and it's one that, frankly, we don't have the preparedness for or the political appetite for. So would we stand with Taiwan? Well, it's a big question, and it's something that ought to be the focus of the speech tonight. How is it that we make conflict impossible in the South China Sea? Not how can we chuck a bunch of MPs who have sacrificed to raise these issues under the bus.
So how do you feel, Luke de Pulford? Disappointed, disgusted?
Deeply disappointed. I think that we deserve better. The issue deserves better. Don't know what's going on at King Charles Street. They seem to have this labour under this misapprehension that the greater enemy to them than China is the Tory backbenchers. This needs to be sorted out and sorted out pretty quickly.
Isn't party politics a wonderful thing?